3 women walked into that compound before her. One went mad. One ran into the night and never looked back. One stopped breathing, and they called it malaria. Helen didn't know any of this the morning she knelt at that gate, Bible pressed to her chest, joy written all over her face. She thought she was walking into a marriage. She was actually walking into a war. And the woman waiting for her on the other side of that gate had already buried 3 daughters-in-law and was already planning how Helen would become the 4th. This is the story of the fight that followed. Lagos does not sleep. Lagos does not rest. Lagos does not forgive weakness. It chews the soft ones and spits out only what is strong enough to survive it. In the noisy, breathing heart of that city lived a 26-year-old woman named Helen Balogun. She was not the most beautiful girl on her street, though she was beautiful enough to slow a man's footsteps. She was not the richest girl in her church, though what little she had, she gave with open hands. What made Helen different could not be explained by beauty or money. It was the way she prayed, the way the first rain hits cracked, thirsty earth, with force, with purpose. At 4 a.m., when the power went out, when her landlord threatened to throw her belongings into the street, old Mama Yatunde next door used to press her ear to the wall just to listen. "That girl has something," she'd whisper. "Whatever she's carrying, I want it too." Helen's spiritual father, Pastor Emmanuel, had led the small Ajagunle Fellowship for 11 years and had watched Helen grow from a shy teenager into the most consistent intercessor in his congregation. The week before her introduction to the Adami family, he called her into his small office. "Helen," he said, folding his hands on his worn Bible, "I don't know this family you're marrying into, but I know this. When God prepares a woman with the kind of prayer life you carry, it is rarely for her comfort alone. Sometimes it is for a house that doesn't yet know it needs saving. Don't stop praying, even when nothing looks wrong." Helen carried those words with her the way she carried her worn Bible, close and often. In the dry Harmattan season of the year she turned 26, Helen met Tunde Adami, patient, hardworking, a man who loved God without shame. He sold building materials at trade fair and was building his life the way honest men do, brick by brick. They dated for 14 months. Then he took her home. The Adami family house in Ikoyi gleamed. 3 stories, a polished compound, a black Mercedes that never seemed to collect Lagos dust. Tunde's mother, Chief Mrs. Folek Adami, 61, was what Lagos calls an Iya Alagba, a powerful woman. She looked at people the way a butcher looks at a goat. Her daughter, Bimpe, 23, had every sharp edge of her mother's personality and none of the polish. Both women hated Helen from the very first afternoon. That evening, while Tunde stepped out, Bimpe found Helen alone. "We've had 3 women in this family before you," she said quietly. "One went mad, one ran, one died. They called it malaria. We know what it really was. No woman survives this family. I'm telling you now, so you can't say nobody warned you. Run while you still can." Then she walked away. Helen sat very still. Then she opened the small, worn Bible she carried everywhere, read a single verse, and prayed under her breath. She did not run. She stayed. The wedding was beautiful, genuine, not extravagant. The young couple moved into the boys' quarters at the back of the family compound on Chief Mrs. Adami's own generous suggestion. The household staff included a quiet young house help named Comfort, 19, who had worked for the Adami family since she was 16 and had learned, long before Helen arrived, exactly which rooms to avoid and which questions never to ask aloud. She served Helen her meals with a careful kindness that felt, to Helen, like the only warmth in that entire compound. On their 3rd night, Chief Mrs. Adami herself brought Helen a cup of hot Milo. Helen held the cup in both hands. Something told her to pray over it first. She bowed her head, right there in front of her mother-in-law, and prayed, long, specific, deliberate. The mask on Chief Mrs. Adami's face slipped, just for a second. Then she laughed, too loudly. "You pray over everything, even tea." That night, once Tunde was asleep, Helen poured the Milo into a sachet, tied it, and buried it in the compound soil before dawn. 3 days later, the neighbor's cat, the one that had been digging near that exact spot, was found dead. Helen began sleeping with one eye open. Months passed. Helen learned the compound the way a soldier learns a minefield. She noticed the padlocked back room nobody entered and the smell that sometimes drifted from under its door at night. She noticed that on every new moon, Chief Mrs. Adami and Bimpe left together, late, and returned before dawn. She noticed there wasn't a single photograph of Tunde's father anywhere in that house. Then, one night in the second month of her marriage, Helen woke at exactly 2 a.m. to a voice outside the window, low, coming from the ground itself. Not Yoruba, not English, something older. She did not scream. She did not run. She prayed instead, with the authority of someone who had done this before. Every spirit sent against this home, I bind you. Every covenant of darkness, I break it. By the blood of Jesus, I command this gate to be shut. The chanting stopped. Silence dropped over the compound like a heavy cloth. In the morning, Bimpe was staring at her from across the compound, and for the first time, her eyes weren't calculating. They were afraid. Helen would cook, and Chief Mrs. Adami would announce, just as she served, that food had already been ordered from outside. Helen would speak at the table. Bimpe would talk over her, and no one would ask her to finish. Visitors would be introduced to everyone in the house except her. Comfort noticed. She never said anything out loud. She couldn't afford to, not in that house. But she began leaving an extra plate quietly outside the boys' quarters door on the evenings. Helen was left out of the family meal, tapping twice on the door and walking away before Helen could thank her. It was a small kindness. But in that compound, small kindnesses were rare enough to matter enormously. One night, Tunde held her face in both his hands. Helen, how are you still like this after everything they do to you? She only smiled. Because I know something they don't know yet. In the 5th month, the first real fracture appeared. Tunde came home pale and silent. My mother went to my office today, he said. She spoke to Mr. Femi Okafor, my business partner. She told him private things about our finances, things that only someone who had gone through our documents would know. Femi Okafor, a measured, soft-spoken man in his late 30s who had partnered with Tunde on the trade fair supply business for 3 years, had called Tunde immediately afterward, confused and unsettled. Tunde, your mother came to see me today. She said things about your marriage, about money troubles I've never heard you mention. I don't know what's happening in your house, but somebody is trying to put a wedge between us. Tunde sat on the edge of the bed. She's trying to destroy my business, Helen. Her own son's business. Helen took his hand. Tunde, I need to tell you some things. I've waited because I wanted to be sure. I'm sure now. She told him everything. The Milo, the cat, the chanting at 2 a.m., the padlocked room, the missing photographs. Tunde walked to the window. My father didn't die of a heart attack, he finally said. I was 12. I remember. He'd started asking questions about where my mother went at night, about the back room. 1 week later, he was gone. Then we face it together, Helen said. Not with our hands, with prayer. That night they prayed together for the first time. Helen began waking, gasping from dreams she couldn't remember. Thin scratch marks appeared on her arm overnight and vanished by morning. Then, on a Tuesday evening in the 7th month, alone in the house, Helen collapsed in the middle of the room. It was Comfort who found her first, on her way to drop off the evening meal, and who screamed for help loudly enough that Tunde, just arriving through the gate, came running. Together they got Helen onto the bed, and it was Comfort who quietly, without being asked, brought a cool cloth and water and sat outside the door the rest of that night, keeping watch. When Helen came around, Tunde held her tightly. We're leaving tonight. Not yet, she said. The work isn't finished. Helen, who are you? She almost smiled. Just a woman who prays. Helen began a 21-day fast, every lunch break spent in prayer, every evening, every early morning. Midway through the fast, Pastor Emmanuel visited the compound briefly, the first and only time he ever came, and prayed with Helen for less than 10 minutes at the gate, unwilling to enter fully onto ground he could feel was contested. Whatever you're standing against in there, he told her quietly before leaving, you are not standing alone. Heaven has noticed you, Helen. Finish the fast. On day 14, Bimpei stopped eating. By day 17, she was visibly thinner, walking the compound with a wild, distracted look. On day 19, she knocked on Helen's door. I haven't slept in 4 days, she said. Every time I close my eyes, I see things. Things we did. Things Mama did. Your prayers, Helen, they're like fire. She was almost pleading now. Make it stop. I can't make it stop, Helen said quietly. But God can. On the 21st day, at 11 in the morning, Chief Mrs. Adami was mid-laugh on a phone call in the parlor. Then she stopped mid-sentence. Her phone dropped from her hand. She stood, walked to the center of the room, and began speaking. Not to anyone present, but to the ceiling, to whatever had been waiting inside her chest for years. I did it, she said, almost conversationally. I'm the one who gave him the medicine. He was asking too many questions, so I gave him the medicine, and I watched him go. It was Comfort, standing frozen in the doorway with a tray still in her hands, who dropped everything and ran through the compound screaming for the family to come. By the time the household gathered, Bimpei, 2 visiting relatives, Tunde and Helen just back from church. Chief Mrs. Adami was still talking. She spoke for 40 minutes. Tunde stood through all of it without moving, holding Helen's hands so tightly his knuckles went white. Bimpei collapsed to the floor, sobbing. Helen stood at the back of the room, tears running down her face. Not tears of victory, but of someone watching a house finally fall. When Chief Mrs. Adami finished, she looked at Helen. Forgive me, she said, in a voice that barely crossed the room. Chief Mrs. Adami was taken in for questioning. Bimpei gave her own statement. Mr. Femi Okafor, once he learned the full truth, quietly withdrew the complaint he'd nearly filed against Tunde's business, and instead stood by his partner through the following difficult months, never once bringing it up again. A loyalty Tunde never forgot. Tunde grieved. He wept for his father. Finally, after 20 years of pretending there was nothing to weep about. He wept for the women who had come before Helen and hadn't survived. He wept for his mother. Not for what she'd done, but for whatever had first reached into her. Helen held him through all of it. They moved out within the week into a small 2-room flat in Yaba. Comfort, who had nowhere else stable to go once the household began to dissolve, was the one person Helen insisted on keeping in touch with. And 2 years later, it was Helen who helped Comfort enroll in a vocational tailoring class, the beginning of a trade of her own. On their first night in the new flat, Tunde sat across from Helen at their small kitchen table. I owe you an apology. There's a Yoruba saying, Helen said. A corn that has been burned in fire does not return. What's done can't be undone. The only question is what we build from here. She took his hands. And I choose to build with you. 2 years later, a daughter was born. They named her Numi, Light. Pastor Emmanuel baptized her himself, 3 months later, in the same small Ajagunle church where Helen's own prayer life had first taken root. This was never a story about prayerful people who never suffer. Helen was nearly poisoned. She collapsed alone. She lost sleep, lost weight, and there were mornings even she wondered if staying had been the right choice. This is a story about a Yoruba proverb. The death that lives inside a house cannot be killed by medicine from outside it. Some things buried in a family's foundation can only be exposed by someone with the courage to stay and pray. If there's a padlocked room in your own life, this story only asks you one thing. Don't stop praying. Not because it makes you invincible, because it keeps you burning.